Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Whisper in the Well. My grandmother always said that certain things on the farm needed to be respected. The old well, located at the far end of the property, was one of them. Don't go near it after nightfall, she warned, but never explained why. As a child, her words scared me, but as I grew up, I began to dismiss them, thinking it was just another superstition. However, the last time I visited the farm, I realized her warning was much more than that. It was summer, and I had decided to spend a few days with my grandmother, helping with farm work. During the day, the well seemed harmless, covered in moss with an old rope hanging loosely, swaying slightly in the breeze. Even so, even under the bright sun, the air around it felt cooler, and the silence there was different, heavy. On the third night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was low and continuous, something between a moan and a whisper. I looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. The sound came from outside in the direction of the well. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out the back door, feeling the cool night air contrast with the suffocating warmth of my room. The sound grew louder as I approached. It seemed to blend with the wind, but there was something unmistakably human about it. When I reached the well, I shone the flashlight down into its depths. All I saw was darkness, but the sound became clearer. It was words now, spoken in a low, drawn-out tone. "Help me?" I immediately stepped back, a shiver running down my spine. I tripped over a root and nearly fell, but I kept the flashlight pointed at the well, trying to understand what was happening. The words repeated, more insistent. "Help me?" The well's rope started to swing, though there was no wind, as if someone was pulling it from within. Panic overtook me, and I ran back to the house. The next morning, I told my grandmother what had happened. She was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Finally, she said, "Your uncle heard those voices too many years ago. He believed someone was trapped down there, waiting for help." She paused, her voice trembling. "He went down to investigate, and never came back." The day passed in a blur, but that night the sound returned. It was louder and clearer now, as if it was inside the house. I grabbed the flashlight again, this time determined to end it. I returned to the well, clutching an extra length of rope. When I shone the light into its depths, I saw something that made me freeze. A pale, thin hand reaching upward as if trying to grasp the edge. "Help me," the voice said, now sounding almost desperate. Against every instinct, I threw down the rope, hoping someone would grab it. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the rope was yanked violently, nearly pulling me into the well. I let go immediately, and a guttural scream echoed from its depths, sending birds flying from the nearby forest. I woke my grandmother and told her what had happened. She looked at me with fearful eyes. "We'll seal the well tomorrow." The next morning, we hired a mason to seal the well with concrete. He seemed reluctant, saying there was something odd about the place, but he completed the job anyway. Since then, the nights on the farm have been quieter, but occasionally, I still hear that whisper in my dreams. "Help me," it says, like an echo that never fully fades away. Story 2. The Silent Attic. When I moved into the old house, I knew it had a history. The previous owners had abandoned it abruptly, leaving behind furniture, clothes, and even kitchen utensils. It was as if they had left in a hurry, and no one knew exactly why. The house was enormous, with an attic that seemed to grab my attention from the very first day. The attic door was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, a dark wooden door with a rusted lock. During the move, I noticed it was locked. When I asked the landlord about it, he simply said, "Don't worry about the attic. It's better to keep it closed." I tried to ignore my curiosity, but the silence behind that door seemed to be watching me. On my first night in the house, while trying to sleep, I heard a low, continuous noise. It sounded like a faint scratching coming from above. The wind? Maybe. But the thought wouldn't leave me. I climbed to the hallway, stopping in front of the attic door. I pressed my ear to the wood, trying to hear better. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the other side. "Are you there?" the voice said. I stepped back quickly, locking the door to my bedroom. I spent the rest of the night awake, hearing the same scratches and occasionally what sounded like slow, light footsteps on the ceiling. The next morning, I decided I had to open the attic. I spent the day searching for a master key, and by late afternoon, I found one in the basement. With the key in hand, I waited until nightfall when the house was immersed in silence. I climbed to the door, my heart pounding. The lock clicked with a loud snap, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a staircase that led into darkness. The smell of mold and something metallic hit me immediately. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed, each step creaking under my weight. The attic was spacious but empty, except for a rocking chair in the center, facing the window. The air was colder up there, and my breath formed visible clouds. As I approached the chair, I noticed something strange. Marks on the floor, as if it had been dragged repeatedly from one side to the other. The window was covered in dust, but behind it, I saw something that made me freeze. Reflected in the glass was a figure sitting in the chair, a tall, thin silhouette with glowing eyes in a pale hue. I turned around quickly, but the chair was empty. The figure had vanished. I felt a cold breeze pass through me, and the chair began to rock slowly, its creaking filling the silence. I ran out of the attic, locking the door behind me. But that night, the house's silence was replaced by noises from above. Footsteps, low laughter, and scratches that seemed to pierce the ceiling. I spent the entire night sitting in the living room, unable to return to the second floor. The next day, I called a specialist to seal the attic. He worked for hours, but as he sealed the door, he looked at me with an odd expression. "You heard it, didn't you? Some things don't want to be forgotten." Since then, the attic has remained locked, but sometimes I still feel something moving up there. And on quieter nights, I can hear the rocking chair creaking, as if the presence inside is still waiting for someone brave enough to return. Story 3. The Clock in the Living Room. When I bought the old house, it came fully furnished, including a massive pendulum clock in the living room. It was magnificent, with a carved wooden structure and frosted glass obscuring its inner workings. The sound of its ticking echoed throughout the house, creating a constant presence. However, the clock had a peculiar detail. It was never accurate. Every morning, the hands were in different positions, as if someone moved them during the night. At first, I thought it was just a defect. I hired a clockmaker to adjust the mechanism, but he couldn't find anything wrong. "It's in perfect condition," he said in a tone that seemed to doubt his own words. "But it's almost like this clock has a will of its own." We laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. Things started getting strange on the third night. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the clock, louder than usual, its ticking reverberating through the walls of my bedroom. I got up to check, only to find the hands spinning rapidly, as if someone was forcefully moving them. The pendulum swung in an irregular, almost frantic rhythm. Then it all stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. As I looked closer, I noticed something on the clock's frosted glass. There were fingerprints on the inside, as if someone had been trying to get out. I stepped back, my heart racing, and decided to ignore what I had seen. But the next night, I woke up to the sound of scratching against the glass. I went down to the living room and found the clock still, yet the scratching continued, coming from inside. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. The reflection in the glass showed more than just the room. It showed a tall figure standing behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. When I looked back, the reflection had vanished too, but the fingerprints were clearer than ever. The next day, I decided to get rid of the clock. I called a removal team, but when the workers tried to lift it, they said it was too heavy, as if it were anchored to the floor. While we debated what to do, one of them pointed to the glass. "Something's moving in there," he said, his eyes wide. Everyone stepped back as the pendulum began to swing on its own, slowly, while the ticking sound filled the room again. With no other options, I left the clock where it was. That night was the worst. Around 3 in the morning, the ticking grew deafening, and I heard a low, raspy voice. "Time is running out." I was paralyzed, unable to move, as the pendulum swung faster and the hands spun at a terrifying speed. Then the clock's door creaked open on its own. I didn't stay to see more. I ran out of the house and spent the night in my car. The next day, I sold the house, leaving the clock exactly where it was. The new owner never asked me about it and I never mentioned it. But sometimes I still hear the sound of ticking in my dreams, accompanied by that voice as if the clock is still counting time. My time. Story 4. The Living Painting. When I inherited my great-uncle and aunt's house, I knew it carried old stories and secrets no one dared to tell. In the center of the living room, there was a painting that seemed to dominate the space. It depicted a dense forest with tall, twisted trees and a narrow, winding path that disappeared into the darkness. The most unsettling detail was a silhouette in the background, indistinct but impossible to ignore. It appeared to have its back turned, looking down the path. My great-aunt used to say the painting came with the house and had never been removed. "It's part of it," she'd say in a tone that mixed reverence and fear. When I asked what she meant, she would just shake her head and change the subject. On the first night I spent in the house, something about the painting deeply unsettled me. Every time I looked at it, I felt the silhouette had moved closer to the center of the painting, as if it were advancing. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but by the next morning I was certain something was wrong. The trees in the painting appeared different, more twisted, as if they had leaned in toward the path. On the third night, I woke up to a scratching sound. I went downstairs to the living room, lighting my way with my phone's flashlight. The sound was coming directly from the painting. As I approached, I saw that the silhouette was now in the middle of the painting, right at the center of the path. Its form was clearer, tall, thin, with unnaturally long arms. Suddenly, the scratching grew louder, and the glass on the painting began to tremble. I stepped back, my heart pounding as I watched the trees in the painting start to shift as if they were alive. The silhouette turned its head, now facing me directly. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to my room and locked the door. The next day, I decided to remove the painting. When I tried to take it off the wall, I realized it was impossibly fixed, as if the frame were part of the wall itself. I called a carpenter who tried to dismantle it, but the moment he touched the frame, he recoiled, saying he felt something strange like a slight shock. "This isn't just a painting," he muttered nervously before leaving. That night, the scratching returned, but this time it came from within the wall. When I went back downstairs, the silhouette had moved entirely to the edge of the painting, as if ready to step out. The room's air was icy and a low, continuous whisper filled the space. "Let me out." I fled the house and spent the night in my car. The next day, I covered the painting with a sheet and decided to sell the property. Since then, I've never returned to that house, but sometimes when I see reflections in windows or mirrors, I feel that the silhouette is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to fully escape the frame. Story 5. The Porcelain Doll. My grandmother was always a passionate collector of antiques. Among the old furniture, stopped clocks, and rusty music boxes, there was a porcelain doll she kept on a special shelf in her bedroom. The doll wore a flawless blue dress and had glassy eyes that seemed to follow anyone who passed by. Ever since I was a child, that object had made me uncomfortable. My grandmother, however, referred to it as her favorite treasure. When she passed away, the house and its belongings became my responsibility. While clearing out her things, I decided to get rid of many items, but I hesitated when it came to the doll. Disposing of it felt wrong, so I placed it in a box and brought it to my house, thinking it would be forgotten in some corner. However, I soon realized it wouldn't be so simple. On the first night, as I was organizing the boxes, I noticed something strange. The doll, which I had left in the basement, was sitting on the couch in the living room. I thought maybe I had misplaced it, but the sense that something was off was undeniable. I returned it to the box, sealed it tight, and left it in the basement again. The next morning, I found the doll at the top of the basement stairs, tilted slightly forward as if it had been watching me. This time, I was sure it wasn't my imagination. I placed the doll in a bag and took it to the neighborhood dump, thinking that would be the end of it. But that night, the discomfort persisted. Around midnight, I heard faint, light footsteps in the hallway, despite knowing I was alone. When I woke up the following day, the doll was sitting at the kitchen table. My body froze. The bag had been tightly secured, and the dump was miles away. There was no logical explanation for how it had gotten there. I decided it had to be destroyed. Grabbing a hammer, I took it to the backyard, but just as I was about to strike it, I heard a whisper, "Why do you want to hurt me?" The voice was soft and childlike. I immediately stepped back, my hands trembling. The doll seemed to be smiling, a smile I was sure hadn't been there before. Abandoning the hammer, I decided to burn it instead. I built a fire pit and threw the doll into the flames. The fire roared higher than I expected, but as the doll burned, a high-pitched scream echoed from everywhere at once. After that, things were strangely quiet. I thought it was over, but that night, I woke to the sound of laughter coming from the basement. I cautiously went downstairs and saw something that left me petrified. On the floor where I had first placed the doll were small footprints burned into the wood. Next to them was a fragment of the blue dress that should have been consumed by the fire. Since then, I've been haunted by faint sounds of footsteps and the soft giggles of a child echoing through the house on silent nights. No matter what I do, the feeling that the doll is still here never goes away. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glint of glassy eyes watching me, waiting. Story 6. The Bedroom Mirror. When I moved into the old apartment, the only piece of furniture left by the landlord was a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall of the master bedroom. The golden frame was intricately detailed, depicting angels and arabesques. It looked like a museum piece, but something about it made me uneasy. Its reflection seemed darker than the surrounding room, as if it showed something beyond what was truly there. On the first night, as I lay in bed, I felt an odd discomfort. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could hear a faint noise coming from the mirror, like a soft scratching sound. I woke up in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling of being watched. I glanced at the mirror and, for a fleeting moment, thought I saw a shadow move within it. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing. The next day, I tried to ignore what had happened. However, as I was getting ready for work, I noticed something peculiar in the mirror's reflection. In the background, I saw a door that didn't exist in the room. I thought it was a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. It was a simple wooden door, dark and slightly ajar, revealing an absolute blackness beyond. That night, the discomfort grew. The scratching noise became louder, and the mirror's reflection seemed even darker. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze as though someone had passed by me. I looked back at the mirror, and the door was now wide open. Inside it stood a tall silhouette, still and unmoving, with eyes that gleamed a pale silver. My body froze in fear, but in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. Over the following days, I started covering the mirror with a sheet, but the unease persisted. At night, the scratching sound continued, now seemingly coming from inside the room. One early morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps. My breathing quickened as I noticed, in the reflection of the covered mirror, the same silhouette standing next to my bed. When I turned to look, the room was empty. Desperate, I decided to remove the mirror. I hired a mover, but when he tried to take it down, he gave me a strange look. "This mirror, it feels like it's stuck," he said, pulling at it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. As we gave up, I distinctly heard a whisper emanating from the glass. "You can't take me away." Afraid to stay in the apartment, I started sleeping in the living room. Even so, the presence seemed to follow me. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. I rushed to the bedroom and saw the mirror cracked, though it still clung to the wall. In the fragmented reflection, I saw pieces of the silhouette, as if it was trying to emerge. Since then, I've left the apartment. But the mirror remains there, still firmly attached to the wall, its cracks forming a pattern that eerily resembles eyes. Sometimes in my dreams, I see that door again, and the silhouette is closer, as if reminding me, "You're still mine." Story 7. The Voice in the Wall. When I rented the small apartment in the city center, I was charmed by its vintage allure. The place had exposed brick walls, tall windows, and an almost comforting silence that contrasted with the chaos outside. But during the first week, I noticed something odd about the walls. At night, when everything else was quiet, I heard a faint noise, like a distant murmur. I assumed it was coming from the neighbors, but the sound was unmistakably coming from the wall next to my bed. On the second night, the murmur grew clearer. It was a low, drawn-out voice, speaking words I couldn't quite understand. Pressing my ear against the wall, I tried to listen more closely, but the sound stopped the moment I did. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building settling or faulty plumbing. But things started to escalate. Always at the same time, around midnight, the murmuring would return, but now it seemed closer. One night, while I was reading in bed, I clearly heard someone say, "I'm here." A chill ran down my spine. I froze, scanning the room, but I was alone. The voice was coming from the wall, louder now. The next morning, I mentioned the strange sounds to the building's superintendent. He gave me a somber look. "You're hearing the wall, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "That apartment has been empty for years because the last tenants all complained about noises. Some say the old owner. Well, he disappeared in there," the superintendent added hesitantly. "No one knows what happened, but after that, people started hearing things." I decided to investigate. Tapping along the wall, I tried to determine if there was a hollow section or hidden space. The sound I got in return was strange, as if the wall was emptier than it should be. I grabbed a small tool and started chipping away at the plaster, revealing bricks that seemed oddly misplaced. Carefully removing one, I uncovered a small compartment inside the wall. What I found made my heart race: an old notebook and a few photographs. The photos showed a man sitting exactly where my bed was now. In each picture, he looked thinner and more exhausted, until the final one, where his eyes appeared sunken and his face disturbingly distorted. The notebook was filled with frantic, incoherent scribbles, talking about a voice in the wall, unsettling dreams, and the feeling of being watched. One line stood out: "The voice wants to take me. If you find this, don't listen." That night, the sounds came back louder than ever. The voice repeated my name over and over, mixed with scratching and knocks on the wall. The air in the room grew heavy, and a faint moldy smell permeated the space. When I stood to leave, the wall began to crack slowly, and for a brief moment, I saw something move inside, a long, misshapen shadow with glinting eyes watching me. I fled the apartment and never returned. I left everything behind, but sometimes I still wake up at night with the sensation that the voice is calling my name. In my dreams, I see those cracks again, as if something is waiting for the right moment to break through the wall and find me. Story 8: The Child in the Field. My family always owned a country house, a remote place surrounded by tall trees and open fields. We spent summers there, and as a child, I loved exploring every corner of the property. But there was one area my parents always forbade me from visiting: a small, empty field at the back of the property, overgrown with tall grass and dominated by an old, worn-out scarecrow. They said the place was dangerous, but they never explained why. Years later, when I inherited the house, I returned to spend a few days there alone. The field looked eerier than I remembered. The scarecrow was still there, leaning forward slightly, dressed in tattered clothes and wearing a dirty, weathered hat. The silence in that area felt strange, almost suffocating, but I couldn't resist my growing curiosity to explore. On the first night, as I rested in the living room, I heard what sounded like faint laughter, distant and childlike. I walked to the window but saw nothing. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the field. I decided to ignore it and went to bed, but in the middle of the night, I woke up with an odd feeling. Looking out the window, I saw something moving in the field, a small figure darting through the tall grass, disappearing behind the scarecrow. The next day, I ventured into the field to investigate. The closer I got, the heavier the silence became. The scarecrow seemed different, its cloth head now turned directly toward the house, as if it were watching me. I looked around but saw no sign of the child I had seen. Only the tall grass swayed slightly, even though there was no wind. That night, the laughter returned, louder this time. I stepped out onto the porch, shining a flashlight toward the field. The figure was there again, but this time it didn't move. It stood still, next to the scarecrow, holding its straw hand. My eyes widened as I realized the scarecrow's head was tilted downward, as if it were looking at the child. I ran back inside and locked all the doors. The laughter persisted, interspersed with soft tapping on the windows, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. When I finally mustered the courage to look, I saw the child standing outside. Its face was partially hidden in shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, and it clutched a piece of straw in its hand. The figure smiled and vanished into the darkness. The next morning, I decided the scarecrow had to go. Armed with an axe, I marched into the field. As I struck it down, a strong smell of rotting earth filled the air, and something fell out of the scarecrow. It was a small, ragged doll, dirty and torn, but with glassy eyes that seemed too lifelike. I buried everything in the field, including the doll, and returned to the house. But that night, the laughter didn't stop. It was closer now. The sound no longer came from the field, it was inside the house. I woke up to find small handprints, dirty and smeared, on the bedroom door, as if a child had been trying to open it. At the window, I saw the familiar figure standing outside, clutching the doll. It whispered, "Why did you leave us here?" I sold the house soon after and never went back. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear faint laughter echoing in my mind, as if the field is still calling me back. Story 9. The Night Visitor. When I rented my new house in a quiet neighborhood, I thought I had finally found the piece I was looking for. It was a simple house, surrounded by trees with a small garden out front. The first week went by uneventfully, but on the second night, something strange happened. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with the distinct feeling that someone was outside. I got up and went to the living room window but saw nothing. The garden was still, illuminated only by the faint light of the moon. I went back to bed, but the sense of being watched lingered. The next night, I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps in the garden. I looked out the window again, and this time I saw a figure standing near the fence. It was tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but as soon as I blinked, the figure was gone. The next day, I asked my neighbors if they had noticed anything unusual, but no one had seen anything. One neighbor, an elderly woman, gave me a concerned look. "Did you see the man in the hat?" she whispered. "If you did, don't look at him again. He'll come back." I dismissed it as a local superstition, but that night the footsteps returned, louder this time and closer to the house. When I peered out the window again, the figure was standing in the middle of the garden, staring directly at me. Despite the hat hiding its face, I felt its eyes on me. Suddenly, it began walking toward the house, its steps slow but deliberate. I closed the curtains and locked the door, trying to ignore the sound of its approach. Moments later, I heard soft tapping on the living room window. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. The garden was empty, and there were no footprints on the damp ground. Determined to uncover the truth, I installed security cameras the next day. That night, as I reviewed the footage, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Around 3 a.m., the figure appeared in the corner of the screen, standing by the fence as before. Slowly, it began walking toward the house, but as it got closer, the video feed flickered and turned to static. The following morning, I found smudges on the living room window, as if long, thin fingers had pressed against the glass. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer and began packing to leave. But on my final night, the most terrifying incident occurred. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. This time, they were inside the house. I got up, trying to stay quiet, and grabbed a flashlight. The footsteps led to the living room. When I entered, I froze. The figure was standing in the center of the room, wearing its hat tilted to one side, its arms hanging unnaturally low. Before I could react, it tilted its head toward me and whispered in a low, raspy voice, "You shouldn't have looked." I ran out of the house and never went back. Even now, years later, I still dream of the man in the hat, standing silently by my bed, waiting. And sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with the unshakable feeling that he's still there, watching me. Story 10. The Box in the Attic. When my great-aunt passed away, it fell to me to clear out her house. It was an old place, filled with dusty furniture, locked trunks, and shelves crammed with books. Despite its nostalgic charm, The house had an unsettling atmosphere, as if time had stopped. Among all the rooms, the attic was the strangest. The door was locked and no one seemed to know where the key was. After days of sorting through the house, I finally found the key in a drawer in the master bedroom. That afternoon, I decided to venture up to the attic. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, and the smell of mold grew stronger with each step. The space was cramped, filled with old boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. At the far end of the attic, I found a small wooden box, weathered with age and secured with a rusty lock. On its lid, a warning was carved, "Do not open." That message sent a shiver through me, but curiosity outweighed caution. Why would my great-aunt keep such a box? I carried it downstairs and, unable to find a key, pried it open with a screwdriver. As the lid creaked back, a damp, earthy smell filled the air, and a chill ran down my spine. Inside were a stack of old letters and a small cloth doll with gleaming glass eyes that seemed unnaturally vivid for something so old. The letters were scrawled in hasty handwriting, speaking of strange dreams, whispers in the night, and the feeling of being watched. One line in particular stayed with me: "She is in the box, but not forever." Unease settled over me, but I placed the doll in a drawer and tried to push the incident from my mind. That night, the nightmare began. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something falling to the floor. Groggy, I got up to investigate and found the drawer open, the doll sitting in the center of the room. My heart pounded as I stared. Maybe I hadn't closed the drawer properly? I convinced myself it was just an oversight. But as I bent to pick up the doll, a faint whisper broke the silence. "Why did you take me out?" Panicked, I shoved the doll back into the box and carried it to the basement. However, later that night, I woke again. The doll was sitting in the chair beside my bed, leaning slightly forward as if watching me. Fear gripped me and I decided it was time to get rid of it. The next morning, I drove to a nearby forest and buried the doll in the box deep in the ground. For a few days, everything seemed normal. But a week later, I woke to the sound of scratching from the attic. Dread filled me as I climbed the stairs and opened the door. There, in the same corner I had found it, was the box, intact as if it had never been moved. This time, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I sealed the attic door and called a priest to bless the house. The attic was boarded up and I moved out soon after. But even now, in my new home, I sometimes hear faint footsteps overhead, like something pacing back and forth. In my dreams, I see the doll's glass eyes, reflecting my own fear as its voice whispers softly, "You cannot hide me forever." If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.